Are you ready, kids?
Hello, it's Employee Emilian, and welcome back to SpongeComs. Today's episode is Season 2, Episode 14, or Episode 34 overall. Welcome to the Chum Bucket and Frankendoodle, both of which originally aired on Nickelodeon on January 21st, 2002. We have just taken a slight detour into 2002. This was mostly a Season 3 year, but there were some Season 2 episodes left to broadcast, and this one aired alongside the first couple episodes of Season 3. And let's just jump right into it, because there is some interesting stuff that comes with that. Welcome to the Chum Bucket was written by Walt Dawn, Paul Tibbitt, and Mr. Lawrence, Mr. Blue Lawrence, and was directed by the former two, Walt Dawn and Paul Tibbitt. The thing I wanted to mention first about this episode is that clips of Mr. Krabs and Plankton from this episode, this one right here especially, I used in the opening cinematic for the video game Super Sponge. Funny thing is, Super Sponge was released on PlayStation on August or September 2001, several months before this episode, so this was the first time the general public saw this brand new SpongeBob content, and they didn't even know. And it really goes to show just how stretched SpongeBob's broadcast schedule can get when it really wants to be. And I believe Mr. Krabs says here that he's been playing card games with Plankton for 15 years. And I don't know if that's meant to say he's been feuding with him for 15 years, because later they retconned this to 25, and I think these days they don't really care about how long they've been feuding, because at this rate it's going to be longer than, not going to be as long as the show itself has been on. But yeah, this is a pretty cool, pretty adult, very consequential, of adult consequences, way of starting a SpongeBob episode, if that makes any sense. Like with SpongeBob, you expect it to be kiddie and enjoyable and optimistic, but it starts with a failed gamble on Mr. Krabs' part, and Plankton does say that he's been just waiting for Krabs to slip up and bet a little too many chickens, but then he later says that he cheated anyway, so how many layers is he on? He is like a little baby, my friend. I think the thing that I loved the most about this episode when I was younger, and even as a teenager, was the art direction for it, because it is a very desolate and very moody and very metal and electric atmosphere that they're building, and it's probably the scariest the Chum Bucket has ever been, aside from maybe its debut appearance. It shows that even in the second season, there were still things to introduce about the world of SpongeBob. This was our first super extended stay in the Chum Bucket, and it really works. It really does feel dramatic for SpongeBob. I'd argue that this is probably one of the most emotional and dramatic episodes of the whole series. It's probably up there or even beyond something like Have You Seen the Snail, where they really lay in on the drama. And it really sets it apart, especially with everything else from this season. Like, I think that this is what they were intending their big magnum opus episode to be, the one that, even after SpongeBob's over, people would remember. And, well, there was just way too much good in Season 2 for just one episode to really stick out. I mean, it's paired with one of my very favorite episodes. Not that this isn't a particularly great episode, but again, such a great lineup of episodes here. And Welcome to the Chum Bucket is no exception, and it still plays into a lot of SpongeBob fun with it. Like, even if you aren't really invested in the drama, you're laughing at it because it's just so strange of a situation. Like, of course, there is emotion coming out of this, but it's about an employee's contract being switched over to another restaurant, so in the real world, it shouldn't be this emotional, but for SpongeBob, it's like letting go of a lover. And this song, even if it's drenched in that sort of irony, is just amazing to listen to. And Clancy Brown is just really going to town with Mr. Krabs' vocal performance. He is in a lot of other things, and he's got a darn good singing voice here. And yeah, despite being very dramatic and despite being very sad, they're still putting the effort in to make it entertaining. And that's what's so incredible about this period of SpongeBob, is that they're always thinking about that. They're always looking out for all of their potential viewers, and that's just really fun, while still keeping the same spirit as with the first batch of episodes. And a funny thing about the live action segment in this episode, where it briefly cuts to a geek on a calendar, a science calendar that just said science, that were apparently, the writers were the animators, animation directors, were apparently supposed to get the head of human resources for Nickelodeon to do that cameo, but he was insulted and he did not want to be remembered that way. I guess the SpongeBob writers have it out for human resources now, judging by the way they depict it as full of punks, full of betas and selling out, so food for thought for a food-based episode. But anyway, they eventually settled on an artist for SpongeBob in the early seasons, Nick Jennings, to do that cameo. And I can tell he got the joke and dressed himself as nerdily as possible, and it's one of the most striking parts of the episode, and it just still really fits. Another thing about this episode that I really do admire as I get older, aside from them not really zooming in far enough for this little shaking segment, and yeah, that is less than forgivable. They should have known. They should have seen it on a better monitor. But aside from that goof up, I do really appreciate Plankton's side of the story here, that it is an episode about being someone's authority figure and having good boss skills and good balance in maintaining your employees' morale. Because SpongeBob does start off depressed and unhappy with his working conditions, but then he just becomes a spoiled brat, and Plankton totally lets him be these two different things with no happy in between. That is a given when SpongeBob's working for Mr. Krabs. It kind of shows how antisocial Plankton is when he can't really find that good balance of a good boss and a stern boss that Mr. Krabs can. It's presented with jokes about being an overbearing and spoiling parent, but yeah, it's very... They should show this in workplaces. And a thing about his exchange with Karen is that it's got an old joke and a brand new joke, because it shows the same graphics for SpongeBob as in fun, but it also has this routine where Karen says something, Plankton ignores it, and then he thinks it's his own idea, that they use later on, and I always remember it coming from this episode specifically, and it just kind of seems like they're just repeating trodden ground, but it is a pretty decent Plankton joke about their dynamic, and, you know, I like it. That was also, I think, our second appearance of Sea Leprechauns, because we got that Sea Leprechaun book in Grandma's Kisses when Grandma was reading it to Patrick, and now Plankton's reading it to SpongeBob, so must be a favorite of his. And something about this ending that a lot of people have pointed out, myself included, is that it is very similar to the Simpsons Treehouse of Horror segment Frankenhomer, or Homer's Dream from the second Halloween special, in that a boss is unsatisfied with how his employee acts, so he puts the brain of that employee into a robot, but the robot still acts like that employee. That's the joke of that segment, and they do it for a minute here, And I don't know if it's a direct inspiration or if they just went for Frankenstein like The Simpsons did and just decided to do it. But there hasn't been a lot of comment on this from the creators of the show. I read somewhere that Steve didn't exactly like seeing SpongeBob compared to The Simpsons, and you can kind of see that in the Square Roots documentary, where when showing examples of 90s animation, they show Family Guy, Beavis and Butthead, and South Park, but The Simpsons is surprisingly absent, and there's Robot SpongeBob reading a comic about himself, for some reason. But yeah, about The Simpsons. I can't imagine why he didn't like that, but I really don't. I can really kind of understand, like, if I was this big YouTuber, the next big YouTuber, I wouldn't like to constantly be compared to one of my predecessors in the field. And it really goes a long way of showing that Steve really did care about how SpongeBob was perceived by the mainstream. Won't get into any nitty-gritty about how the franchise is being treated now in these commentaries, because they're about how SpongeBob was back then, and back then you could always count on just amazing instant classics. Not that you can't nowadays, but especially around this point in Season 2, they were just constantly knocking it out of the park and making some of my favorite animated episodes of all time, and Welcome to the Chum Bucket is no exception. I really love this episode, and its story, and its characters, and its jokes. Everything about it, except for that one little animation quirk, is pretty spot on to what I want from SpongeBob. Frankendoodle was again directed by Paul Tibbitt and Walt Dawn, and this time written alongside them by Meriwether Williams, and you can really feel her energy coming through in this one. I like how this is kind of a meta episode in that it's about drawing, it's about cartoons, it's about letting cartoons become these out-of-control freaks of nature, which has perfectly described some 90s cartoons, including SpongeBob in some small ways. And I really like these little live-action bookends to the episode with Mr. Lawrence as the altist at sea. And you can kind of see the rope holding him back from just flowing into the ocean. Kind of ruins the illusion a little bit, but wouldn't be live-action SpongeBob if it wasn't a little cheesy. I like this little rock, paper, scissors bubble-blowing contest. Why does Patrick always pick paper? Well, have you ever tried blowing a scissors-shaped bubble? It's not that easy. And it's neat foreshadowing. So yeah, a bit meta. These cartoon characters have to deal with a pencil that can bring their peers to life. It's a very weird episode and a very zany one, but like Shanghai, it is among the very best because it takes those and warps it into this magical adventure with just a bunch of memorable jokes. I'd go as far as to say this is probably one of the 5 most memorable episodes of the entire show. Like, you don't really see it described as the very best by a lot of people. You'll often see Pizza Delivery, Band Geeks, Chocolate with Nuts, Wet Painters in that category, but Frankendoodle does have its own particular level of acclaim, and I think it has dang well earned that. Mostly because of DoodleBob, who is played by Paul Tibbitt, and he is just such an amazing DoodleBob. I'm very happy that they haven't replaced him and that in video games and later episodes of the show, they still use archival recordings from this episode because his performance is just that wacky and that good. He's just that good at portraying this weird, creepy, surreal alien-like SpongeBob. But even before that part of the episode, this is just a really fun idea for an episode before it morphs into this big Frankenstein thing. Of SpongeBob and Patrick just drawing things and seeing them come to life. It lasts just long enough to be satisfying before they go for something major in the second act. That's kind of admirable on their part. And yeah, I do really like this little jellyfish of Patrick's design that looks more like Squidward. Well, it's a Squidward that looks more like a jellyfish. And this is fun, them going into more of a prankster mindset for this one. And then DoodleBob comes to life after this. Squidward changed pretty quickly, didn't he? And even though he is tossed around and beaten up, he isn't really part of the story. He's used more as SpongeBob and Patrick will just play a harmless prank on him, and DoodleBob will just outright whip him into shape. And I think that's a good way of showing that SpongeBob and Patrick are the heroes of this, and that they can float in midair. I like that gag. Oh, and here he comes. Here's our little Doodle Boy. He's got quite a few names. He's called Frankendoodle by some people because that's the name of the episode, even though they never refer to him as that in the episode. And SpongeBob flips between calling him Doodle Boy and Doodle Bob. I kind of prefer Doodle Bob because it just looked like a SpongeBob doodle. And I like how Doodle Bob seems like this very strange doodle at first, but then he slowly gets more violent and evil. I think that's a great way to introduce a villain to SpongeBob. And his inane, nonsensical gibberish, for the most part, is just classic. It makes him such an iconic villain that he can't really speak, but he is this very warped, demented fellow, and they go to this weird Teletubby-like field of bushes, and I don't know, I've never seen this before, and I don't think we're ever going to see it again. Savor it while you can, fellas, because it's a pretty decent set piece for this sort of thing. Shows that they're a bit further out, and again, I like that even though SpongeBob is filled with illusions and cartoon gags, this episode prioritizes them and really goes to town with them. I think that's amazing. That this episode by itself has its own little niche. And also, Patrick is just constantly knocking it out of the park with everything he says. Sure, Where's the Leak, Ma'am and Finland are just kind of random access humor, but it works. It really fills the episode up with something else. And also, there are some times where he kind of says that he hates the look of SpongeBob through DoodleBob. And again, purely accidental. It's not him being a jerk to SpongeBob, but yeah, kind of makes you wonder. There is a bit at the end where he's looking at the doodle, but it's framed so that it almost looks like he's looking at a portrait of SpongeBob while saying these things. But again, you can see his eye line. He's looking at the doodle, and that kind of eschews any meanness on his part. Just very careful planning of how it should look. And we're no longer fooling around with DoodleBob because now he's getting very serious about it. There is very real threat of SpongeBob being able to erase DoodleBob, and eventually DoodleBob being able to erase SpongeBob, foreshadowed earlier in the episode, to be fair. But now that DoodleBob's growing a personality, it's become a little more action-y. And I just wanted to mention the legacy of DoodleBob as well. Like, he has almost transcended this episode to become his own little part of the SpongeBob canon. Oh, and Patrick up here is saying something that most people in the YouTube comments tell me. Thanks, Patrick. I shall take that in mind when I yell again. But, yeah. DoodleBob, insanely popular character, and for good reason. Like, I've seen a bunch of memes about him, about his weird gibberish. Like, you could just say "mi hoi minoi," and it just goes on from there. You can just quote all of it without meaning to, and that's kind of cool, I think. And he also appears in the season 11 episode Doodle Dimension, where we learn more about his plane of existence that he's entered and how he wants to stay ruler of it and put SpongeBob and Patrick in their place. Decent idea for a sequel episode, because now they're in his dimension rather than DoodleBob being in their aquatic world longing for a purpose. And this little fight at the end of the episode, I think, is pretty underrated. We always think about the antics with SpongeBob and Patrick and DoodleBob, but SpongeBob just being at DoodleBob's mercy in his own house, I think, is one of the very best parts of this season. And the increasing power of the pencil as well. Like, it can now erase Bikini Bottom life. That is good, that is meta. Not to mention, DoodleBob is also the villain of the spin-off video game Drawn to Life SpongeBob Edition. At least he was on the cover of the DS game, which released in 2008. Talking a lot about video games in this part, and really goes to show that developers of those games really look to this period as their inspiration, and I just find that wonderful and cathartic. And that's an interesting twist, that SpongeBob himself can draw himself with the pencil and it doesn't come out all weird and like DoodleBob. I also really like the ending of this episode, how everything resolves itself. Basically, this is a near flawless effort from SpongeBob, and it's just quintessential classic SpongeBob humor and storytelling. Again, not taking itself too seriously, that's for me and other fans to do. But, yeah. Bonafide classic here. One slight error that I don't think is an error rather than just a little quirk is that the photo real pencil that they use underwater is much shorter than it is when it's in live action. Of course, we know from Pressure that live action interpretations of these cartoon characters are going to be very strange, and in the pencil case, I think that it's just what if it was just a lot longer. I think that kind of works. And mind if I just say that this artist at sea is a very lousy artist? Like, he didn't bring anything other than a pencil that he quickly lost and didn't bring a pencil sharpener for. That's the joke, and Mr. Lawrence does a really good portrayal of this dilemma. And I really like how they link it to ocean, like they have an artist at sea rather than an artist at some factory in the city losing its pencil and it going down the drain. They connected it to the ocean world, and that, I think, is ingenuity and what Stephen Hillenburg wanted from SpongeBob. And it's Tom Kenny's 8th favorite episode of the first 6 seasons, so that accounts for something. Went all this way without bringing out that list. My question of the week for you last week was, what's your idea for a SpongeBob special? A lot of great answers, a lot of answers, since it was the first time I made SpongeComs public in a while. Not gonna be for a while again, sorry. Super Mario Plushes says his idea is the Eggy Weekend, SpongeBob Easter special where he dresses up as the Easter Bunny. That's pretty decent. Rail Systems is The Wonderful World of Krusty, which is basically Sandy and the Wizard of Oz. That's a pretty good idea. Jack McGinn's is that they make multiple episodes and fans have to choose one. The one they choose is, and the one that isn't is stored away somewhere, never to be seen again. Oh, come on. Don't give the Lost Media Wiki more than it has at the moment. At least hear it on DVD if you can. Jack and Rebel Friend, Jack McGinn took my idea. Come on! All the SpongeBob. Show all the SpongeBob. I know the fandom has a problem at the moment of being particularly nosy, but yeah, release everything you can. Come on. Great ideas, but not my personal agreements. I mean, have your opinion, but whatever. Ice Cream Heroes' vote on what plot Plankton gets to do to steal the formula. Not a bad idea. Finally, Super Seals. Maybe if SpongeBob has to take care of a present, and the viewers get to decide what the present is. That's pretty good. Like, they vote online against, like, is it a puppy, or an Easter egg, or a new spatula? Probably the new spatula will win because it fits the best. That's just an idea I formulated off the top of my head, nothing concrete. I am not taking these ideas to the SpongeBob writers. But one can dream. There are a lot of great ideas for SpongeBob specials, and for the longest time they just took normal episodes and made them double length, and that was kind of an underwhelming period in the show's history for that reason among many others, but who am I to complain? My question of the week for you this week and the next, and going into April, what is your favorite DoodleBob quote? There's a lot of great ones to choose from, so don't be afraid to speak up and share your favorites. Very quotable character. Who knows? Maybe it's one I haven't thought of. But join me again in early April for the turmoil and the pressure and the eventual satisfaction of the Secret Box and Band Geeks. Goodbye for now.